Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be tackling the Bayh-Dole Act.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's this piece of legislation that I think most people haven't really heard of, but it's
Right.
had a huge impact on everything from technology to
Yeah.
the way we get those life-saving medications that we see advertised all the time.
It's really fascinating, actually, how this act has kind of shaped the world around us, and most people don't even realize that it exists.
Yeah,
It's really the bridge between, those amazing discoveries that are happening at university labs,
right.
and then the products that we can actually buy and use. So,
Okay, so before we get into like all the really nitty-gritty details, can you kind of paint a picture of what the research landscape looked like
sure.
before Bayh-Dole came along in the 1980s?
Yeah, so imagine a situation where the government funds research,
Mm-hmm.
but then the government ends up owning all the inventions that come out of that research.
Okay.
It was a very bureaucratic maze to try and navigate to get those inventions actually out into the world where they could benefit people.
Oh, so it was like a recipe for really great ideas to just get stuck in red tape.
Exactly, and that's where the Bayh-Dole Act comes in. It
Oh,
really flips the script on that.
right.
Instead of the government automatically owning those inventions, it gives small businesses and universities the right to own and license the inventions that come from federally funded research.
Wow.
So it's all about incentivizing them to develop those inventions and bring them to market.
So that's like a huge shift in how we think about government-funded research and like the private sector working together.
Absolutely. And to really understand how it works,
Yeah.
we need to look at the key players that are involved.
Yeah.
You've got the contractors.
Okay.
Now, when I say contractors, don't think of somebody with, a hard hat and a construction site.
Right.
Contractors in this case are those universities and businesses that are doing that research.
Okay, so the people that are actually doing the research.
Exactly.
Okay.
You've got the federal agencies that are providing the funding.
Right.
And of course, the inventors themselves.
And I'm guessing the inventors aren't just left out in the cold here.
Not at all. The Beta Act ensures that the inventors get a share of the royalties
Oh,
if
okay.
their invention takes off.
That makes sense.
So it really recognizes their role in this process.
Okay, now I understand that while the Bayh-Dole Act really encourages this like private ownership,
Right.
it's not a complete giveaway right. The government still keeps some pretty important rights
That's right.
over these inventions.
They keep what's called a non-exclusive license.
Okay.
Think of it like this. The government keeps a copy of the blueprint of the invention.
Okay.
So they can use it for government purposes, even if a company's out there selling it commercially.
Gotcha.
It's their way of ensuring that the taxpayers
Yeah.
still benefit from the research they funded.
Okay, so it makes sense, but I've also heard about these margin rights,
Yes.
and that sounds pretty powerful.
They are a very key part of this act.
It's like the government has this secret weapon or something?
Well, imagine a company sitting on a potentially life-saving invention.
Right.
Maybe it's the cure for a disease, or they decide to jack up the price so no one can afford it.
Yeah, I could see how that would be a problem.
Exactly. That's when these march-in rights come in.
Okay.
The government can essentially march in and grant licenses to other companies
Wow.
to produce that invention.
Okay.
So it's a safety valve to make sure that the public actually benefits from these discoveries.
So it's not just about like handing over these inventions to private companies and saying good luck.
Right.
It's really about creating a system where it ultimately benefits the public.
Exactly.
Okay.
And to make sure those benefits are felt here at home,
Yeah.
the Bayh-Dole Act generally requires that products that are based on these inventions are actually manufactured substantially here in the United States.
Okay.
So this helps promote American industry and American labor.
Right.
Although there are waivers if it's just simply not feasible.
To manufacture here.
Right.
Okay, so it's not like a rigid made in America thing,
Right.
but it definitely prioritizes domestic manufacturing whenever possible.
Yes.
Okay, this is all sounding really impactful, but I imagine that there are probably people out there who have some concerns about the Bayh-Dole Act too, right?
Oh, absolutely. There are definitely critics.
Okay.
Some would argue that it prioritizes profits over public access,
Right.
especially when it comes to things like medicine.
Yeah.
So we'll definitely dive into those arguments and explore the different perspectives on the Act's impact.
Sounds like we've got a lot more to unpack here.
We do.
This is already getting pretty interesting.
It is, and to really understand the nuances, we need to get into some of the specific language
Okay.
and examples from the Act itself.
All right, let's do it.
Let's get into some of the specifics from the Act itself.
Okay.
It can feel like we're going into like a legal jungle.
Yeah.
So I'll try to be your guide here.
All right, lead the way. What are like some of the key terms we need to understand?
Well, you'll see this word contractor thrown around a lot.
Yeah.
Now, don't picture like someone in a hard hat, on a construction site.
Right.
A contractor in Bayh-Dole refers to those universities and businesses that are
Okay.
receiving that federal funding for the research.
Okay, so the folks actually doing the research.
Exactly. Now, the research projects themselves, they're laid out in what's called a funding agreement.
Okay.
It's essentially a contract that establishes,
Okay.
the ground rules for the research.
So that's where they hash out, the details of what's being researched,
Right.
how it's all going to work.
Precisely.
Okay.
And when we talk about inventions themselves, the Act calls them subject invent.
Subject invention.
And this doesn't just mean any random idea the contractor comes up with.
Okay.
A subject invention is specifically something that's conceived
Okay.
or first actually built during the work on that federally funded project.
So it has to be directly tied to the research that the government is paying for.
You got it.
Okay.
And the Act gets even more specific.
Oh, boy.
It breaks down the invention process into what they call conception and reduction to practice.
Okay. I'm already sensing a headache coming on.
No worries, I'll keep it simple.
Too much legal jargon.
Conception is basically that light bulb moment
Okay.
when the inventor has a very clear plan
Okay.
for the invention, and then reduction to practice is when
Yeah.
they actually build it
Okay.
and show that it works.
So going from idea to working prototype.
Exactly. And both of these milestones,
Okay.
they have to happen within the scope of that research project
Okay.
for it to be considered a subject invention under Bayh-Dole.
Makes sense. So we've got our subject invention.
Right.
Now, who actually owns it?
That's where Bayh-Dole gets really interesting.
Okay.
It generally gives ownership to the contractor,
Okay.
allowing them to potentially profit
Yeah.
from licensing or selling that invention.
Wow. So that's a big change from the government just owning
A
everything.
huge shift. The idea was to incentivize
Yeah.
those contractors to actually take that invention further
Right.
and develop it into something useful.
But the government isn't totally out of the picture, right?
Right.
We talked about these non-exclusive licenses and these marching rights.
Right. You're right.
So you-
Even when a contractor owns an invention,
Yeah.
the government holds what's called a non-exclusive license.
Okay.
Meaning they can still use the invention themselves.
Okay.
Think of it like a backup copy,
Gotcha.
so that taxpayers always benefit from the research.
Okay. So it's not like they're just signing away their rights completely.
Not at all.
Right.
And then we have the marching rights, which we've mentioned, which
Yeah.
are really a big deal.
Yeah.
Let's say a company isn't making that invention available to the public.
Okay.
Maybe they're holding back a life-saving drug.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe the price is just outrageous.
Yeah, that would not go over well.
No, that's when the government can march in and
Yeah.
essentially grant licenses to other companies to produce the invention.
Okay.
A good example of this, think about the anthrax scare back in 2001.
Right.
There were concerns about the price
Yeah.
and availability of the drug Cipro,
Mm-hmm.
which is effective against anthrax.
Right.
That's when people started really talking about the government
Yeah.
potentially using its march in rights.
Wow.
Ultimately, they didn't have to, but it just shows how powerful
Right.
those rights can be.
It's like a very tangible example.
It is.
So it's like a safeguard to make sure that these inventions don't just disappear or
Exactly.
become inaccessible.
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, another interesting piece of this
Yeah.
is that Bayh-Dole generally requires that inventions are manufactured here in the U.S.
Right.
So this is all about promoting American jobs and
Right.
American industry.
Right.
But there are exceptions if it's just impossible to manufacture here.
Due to like specialized needs or the materials aren't here?
Exactly.
Okay, so it's not a hard and fast rule.
Right.
But the Act definitely tries to keep those economic benefits within the U.S.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Now let's talk about what happens after a contractor decides that, yes, they want to own this invention.
Okay, so they've got this potentially game-changing invention. What next?
Well, they can't just sit on it.
Okay.
Bayh-Dole requires them to report
Okay.
to the funding agency
Okay.
about their efforts to actually commercialize the invention.
Okay.
So they have to share updates on licensing agreements,
Mm-hmm.
manufacturing plans, marketing strategies,
Wow.
basically anything they're doing to try and bring this invention to the public.
So there's a degree of transparency and accountability.
Exactly.
Okay.
The government wants to see that their investment
Right.
is being put to good use.
Yeah.
And that ultimately it's benefiting the public.
What happens if a contractor decides they don't want to own an invention?
That's an interesting scenario.
Yeah, why would they ever do that?
Well, it could be for a number of reasons.
Okay.
Maybe they don't have the resources to develop or
Oh,
further.
okay.
Or maybe they just believe that another company
Right.
would be better suited to bring it to market.
So it's kind of a strategic decision, based on, like,
Right.
what they think is best for the invention, even if it means giving up potential profits. Well,
Exactly.
wow.
And in those cases, the government can actually step in
Okay.
and grant ownership to someone else, potentially even the inventor themselves.
Okay.
But there are certain rules and procedures they have
Yeah.
to follow for that.
Makes sense. They want to ensure that the invention ends up in good hands,
Right?
still has a chance to benefit the public.
Exactly.
But amidst all this talk about contractors and licenses and all this other stuff,
Right.
aren't we kind of forgetting someone?
You're right. We can't forget about the inventors.
Yeah. What does the Bayh-Dole Act do to protect the inventor's interests?
Well, for starters,
Okay.
Bayh-Dole mandates
Okay.
that contractors share royalties
Okay.
with the inventors. It's
Okay.
not just a suggestion, it's a legal requirement.
Wow. So even if the inventor isn't the one directly profiting from the invention,
Right.
they still get a cut of the action.
They do.
That seems pretty fair.
It recognizes their essential contribution.
Right.
And while there isn't a set percentage,
Okay.
the contractor has to establish a reasonable royalty sharing policy.
Okay.
Plus, the act also gives inventors some say
Okay.
in the licensing process.
Interesting.
If the contractor wants to grant an exclusive license,
Yeah.
they have to notify the inventor,
Okay.
who then has the right to actually object
Oh, wow.
to the terms.
So they do have a voice. They can push back if they feel like something's not right.
Exactly. It's all about balancing
Yeah.
the needs of all the different players.
Okay, this is really fascinating.
It is.
I had no idea the Bayh-Dole Act covered so much ground.
It does.
But I do have one more question about ownership.
Okay.
What happens when the invention is owned by the government,
Good point.
not a contractor?
We need to talk about that.
Yeah.
There are specific rules for licensing government-owned inventions.
You walk me through that. How does that whole process work?
If someone wants to license a government-owned invention,
Mhm.
they have to submit a request to the relevant federal agency.
Okay.
And that request needs to be pretty detailed,
Okay.
outlining their plan to develop
Okay.
and market the invention.
So the government can evaluate whether they're actually serious
Exactly.
about bringing this to the public.
Precisely.
Okay.
And just like with contractor-owned inventions,
Yeah.
there's a very strong preference for U.S.-based manufacturing.
Okay.
Again, though there are waivers if it's just not feasible.
Makes sense. Now, what about exclusive licenses for government-owned inventions? Is that a common thing?
It's not so fast.
Okay.
The bar is set much higher
Okay.
for exclusive licenses.
Okay.
The government needs to be convinced
Right.
that it's truly in the best interest of everyone involved.
Right.
They have to weigh the benefits and drawbacks
Right.
and make sure that a non-exclusive license wouldn't achieve the same goal.
So they really scrutinize those exclusive license requests.
They do. They need to make sure
Okay.
that granting exclusivity is necessary
Okay.
to attract that investment
Yeah.
and bring that invention to the public.
Right.
But not so much that it stifles competition.
Okay, so it's a delicate balance.
It is.
Now, before we move on,
Yes.
I have one last question about the scope of Bayh-Dole.
Okay.
Does it cover all inventions that are made with government funding?
That's a great question.
What about, say, students who are working on research with their scholarship?
Interesting point.
Yeah.
So Bayh-Dole actually specifically excludes
Okay.
inventions that are made under educational awards,
Okay.
like scholarships or fellowships.
Mm-hmm.
Those are considered to be for the benefit of the student,
Okay.
not for generating commercially viable inventions.
Mm-hmm. So Bayh-Dole is broad,
We're right.
but it also has its limits.
Exactly.
It's clearly a complex piece of legislation.
It is.
But you've done a fantastic job of breaking it down for us.
Thanks. Now that we've got a good grasp of the specifics, I think it's time to kind of zoom out and
Okay.
consider the bigger picture impact
Okay.
of the Bayh-Dole Act.
All right, let's do that. Okay, so we've really gone through like the nuts and bolts of the Bayh-Dole Act.
We have.
But what about like the bigger picture?
Right.
Like what kind of impact has it actually had?
Well, it's widely considered to be a major success story.
Okay.
It's credited with really fueling a surge of innovation,
Okay.
especially in fields like biotechnology and pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, I could see how like giving universities and small businesses that clear path
Right.
to owning and commercializing their inventions
Mm-hmm.
would lead to like way more breakthroughs.
Right.
Actually
Yeah.
reaching the market.
Absolutely. And we're not just talking about like the quantity of inventions,
Right.
but also the quality
Yeah.
and the impact. Think about all the life-saving drugs,
Right.
the groundbreaking medical devices, the
Yeah.
cutting-edge technologies that have really emerged since Bayh-Dole was passed.
Right.
Many of those innovations have roots in research that was initially funded
Wow.
by federal agencies.
So it's probably safe to say that Bayh-Dole has had a pretty profound impact
I would agree,
on scientific progress and ultimately on our lives.
without a doubt.
But as with anything this complex,
Sure.
I imagine there are also criticisms and concerns surrounding it, right?
Absolutely, there are.
And I imagine those often center around, that balance between private profits
Right.
and public benefit.
You hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
Some critics argue that Bayh-Dole has really tipped the scales
Okay.
too far in favor of commercial interests,
Okay.
which leads to inflated prices for essential products
Right.
and limited access for the people who need them most.
It's that classic debate about the role of government in regulating innovation
Yes, yeah.
and ensuring affordability.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels especially relevant when we talk about pharmaceuticals.
It does.
We all hear those stories about life-saving drugs that are probably out of reach
Right.
for a lot of patients.
Absolutely. That's a major point of contention.
Yeah.
Critics argue that the act hasn't done enough to ensure that affordability piece
Okay.
and that the government should be more proactive in using those margin rights
Right.
to address those issues.
So it sounds like kind of a mixed bag.
It is.
On one hand, we've got this incredible innovation,
Right.
but on the other hand, we've got these very real concerns
Mm.
about access and affordability.
It's a complex dilemma
It is.
with no easy solutions.
Yeah, and finding the right balance
Right.
seems like an ongoing challenge.
It is. And as technology advances and
Yeah.
research costs rise,
Yeah.
those challenges are only going to become more pronounced.
It's almost like a constant tightrope walk,
Yes.
trying to encourage innovation,
Mm-hmm.
but also making sure that its benefits are accessible to everyone.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And the Bayh-Dole Act, with all of its complexities and its imperfections,
Yeah,
provides a really interesting case study
it does.
in how we navigate those tricky waters.
I have to say, this has been a really enlightening deep dive.
Good.
I feel like I finally understand the Bayh-Dole Act,
I'm glad.
and it's definitely more fascinating than I initially thought.
It's one of those things that's really impactful, but most people have never heard of it.
Yeah, and even after all this discussion,
Right.
it feels like there are still so many, nuances and questions to explore.
There are.
It really highlights how impactful
Yeah.
this piece of legislation is. So for our listeners out there,
Mm-hmm.
here's something to kind of chew on.
Okay.
We've talked about how these march-in rights can be used
Right.
when a company isn't making an invention available to the public.
Right.
But what if those rights were expanded
Okay.
to explicitly include affordability
Interesting.
as a trigger?
So if a company develops a life-saving drug
Right.
using federal funding,
Yeah.
where prices it out of reach
Yeah.
for most people,
Right.
the government could step in
Exactly.
and license other companies to produce more affordable versions.
Exactly. It would be a bold move,
It would.
but it could potentially have a huge impact
It could.
on access to these essential medications.
Of course, it's not without its potential drawbacks.
Right.
Some would argue that it could stifle innovation
Yeah.
or discourage companies from investing in research.
Right.
If they're worried about the government controlling prices.
It's definitely a complex issue
It is.
with valid arguments on both sides,
Yeah,
but it feels like it's a conversation worth having
I agree.
as we face this rising cost of healthcare
Mm-hmm.
and this challenge of making sure everyone has access
Right.
to the treatments that they need.
Absolutely. It's a conversation that needs to be had.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great point to end on.
I agree.
The Bayh-Dole Act is this powerful example
Mm-hmm.
of how legislation can shape innovation
Right.
and impact our lives in these really profound ways.
Absolutely. And the conversations around it
Yeah.
continue to evolve.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
We hope you learned something new
Yes.
and maybe even had your thinking challenged a bit.
Definitely.
Be sure to tune in next time
Yes.
for another exploration of the forces that are shaping our world.